agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. We've got something a little different for you with this week's midweek episode, or really it's going to be episodes. Jay, Trey, and I recorded a Patreon supporter participation segment, but before we did that, Jay and I did a separate midweek segment thinking that the listener participation thing might not be long enough for a full episode. Well, that turned out not to be the case, and so instead of trying your patience with one super long megasode, that can't be a word, we decided to release 2 midweek episodes this week. Now, on this episode that you're going to hear in a second, Jay and I discuss new China investment restrictions, the Supreme Court's order on ghost gun regulations, Joe Manchin possibly leaving the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump's refusal to sign a Republican presidential nominee loyalty pledge. Midweek episode number 2, which will be coming out tomorrow, will be Jay, Trey, and I, along with some of our Patreon supporters, talking about the recent David Brooks New York Times piece, which asked liberal Democrats to consider the extent to which liberal elites have contributed to the rise and continued influence of Donald Trump. I thought it was a really interesting, pretty wide-ranging discussion of class and economics, which, again, you should see in your feed tomorrow. With that, on to today's midweek episode. I hope you enjoy it. This week, President Biden issued an executive order banning American investment in key high-tech areas that are related to national security, including advanced computer chips, quantum computing technologies, and artificial intelligence. And this order is unquestionably directed at China, but it also covers all of the 12 countries that are designated as countries of particular concern by the State Department, and others, big ones, and there would be Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia. There are a few others as well. Now, in the order, Biden states that while the U.S. is committed to open investment and open capital flows as a cornerstone of our economic policy, these advances by countries of concern in certain technological areas creates what he terms an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Now, in response to this, China's Ministry of Commerce said that the executive order, in their words, seriously deviates from the market economy and fair competition principles the United States has always advocated. It affects the normal business decisions of enterprises, disrupts the international economic and trade order, and seriously disrupts the security of global industrial and supply chains. Now, it seems to me, at least on the domestic front, there's bipartisan support for doing this, for restricting China's access to U.S. technology. I mean, in the Senate, there was a 91-6 vote approving an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that would actually limit investments in countries of concern. But I can see where people who are kind of strict free traders, more libertarianish, would have some issues with this. And certainly there are some folks who are like that in Congress. Jay, what do you think about this executive order of Biden's?
Well, I tend to be on that libertarian free traderish side, and I'm okay with this. I think you can make special. I mean, I think you engage in free trade with free countries, right? I mean, I think maybe that's a better way to put it. And I've had this position for some time when you have a Chinese government that is essentially the Chinese economy, right? And it's not a matter of you are trading with free Chinese private companies or you are essentially, doing the bidding, and you are doing so. Any trade you carry out is under the rules of the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's a different argument to be made than should we aluminum tariffs with Canada, right? Yeah. And I think in sensitive areas, I think that's even more important. So I would say I am, on principle, a free trade libertarian guy, and people should be able to invest wherever they want to invest. But I think China presents an exception, particularly in this area.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm kind of pretty strongly with you on this. I feel like this is an important sort of course correction dating back from, say, 20 or so years ago when we were hoping, the free markets, free society sort of thing and opening up China would, and that clearly did not happen, right? This is a much more repressive regime, authoritarian in a lot of ways. And so I think we're taking...
And I can look, I am big enough to admit that, I was, the folks that urged that, which was me. Well, again, not that anybody was particularly listening to me, back 30 years ago when I was in college, but as to what China policy ought to be. But if they had asked me, that's what I would have said, is that this further engagement will help because the popular wisdom, because it had worked in Eastern Europe, was more economic engagement is going to lead a drive for more, economic freedom breeds political freedom. And it did work in places like Poland and East Germany and Hungary and so forth. It did not work in China.
And,
for a whole bunch of different reasons. I mean, people have written books about reasons why, but I think, it's a course correction now.
And I still think you can make the argument. I certainly haven't dismissed the argument that while free markets might not lead to a free society, that it's difficult to have a free and prospering markets in the long term without an open rule of law based democratic society. And the reason, for instance, there are some things going on in China recently, like foreign direct investment in China down 87% compared to a year ago. It's at its lowest level in like a quarter century. And this is from China's own state agency data. So God knows what the real truth is, right? I mean, their National Bureau of Statistics said that there's actually been a decline in consumer prices, which, that whole deflationary sort of thing. Their exports have been down for the last 3 months. Their imports have been down for the last 5 months. They have a big real estate crisis. And to me, I maybe I'm jumping the gun, but I think maybe this is kind of authoritarian, closed society, non-free trade chickens coming home to roost, possibly in a way. I would hope so.
It's
right?
sort of the same thing of what eventually caused the Soviet Union to collapse. You can only keep this up for so long. Exactly,
and so China had the advantage of by being able to do a lot of catch-up growth and a lot of things initially, but that kind of growth curve that we've gotten so accustomed to, I think it's really running into some huge problems. And I would say, thankfully so, if that in some way helps to open up their society. Although, of course, the negative version of that is, well, in the kind of the throes of that economic calamity or change, that it becomes even more authoritarian as leadership tries to hold on to its grip on power. And certainly Chairman Xi seems to be doing that sort of thing. But I think in the end, Jay, history will vindicate us.
I always assume that it will. Yeah. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to something different here. Back to
although I mean, here's the thing. I think this is interesting because again, we can certainly say that because there's also, I mean, cultural challenges in terms of China.
Oh, sure.
Is different than Poland, Hungary, Eastern Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that, or even in places like say Iran, right, where there was a Western democratic system in place at one time that people still remember and sort of have in their cultural muscle memory, if you will, right? And I don't know that China has ever had that.
Same thing with Russia, right? I mean, there was that technically that little period, but that was just sort of like a little interregnum of chaos, essentially, right? And crony capitalism, horrible corruption sort of thing. I don't know if that even counts, right?
They went straight from the czars to communism, and there was nothing in between. So I don't know. Now that said, you could also look and say at other places in Asia, Japan, South Korea, who have prospered, right? It's working, right? I mean, there are. We can argue about whether the governments of South Japan or South Korea are perfect, but they are,
way more perfect than China.
States.
Yeah. Okay, well let's.
So my point is I'm not saying it's not that it never works.
No.
But it hasn't worked so far in China, and yeah.
Yeah, and China.
The other interesting parallel I was going to bring up is that there's a little bit of the Paul Simon argument. It was just the weird sort of listening to Spotify a while ago, and I came across some Paul Simon songs. So I've always been, this might surprise people, but I am a Simon and Garfunkel fan.
That does seem weird.
Crazy hippie folky kind of. But anyway, as you remember, in the late 1980s, there was, of course, the argument of Paul Simon recorded his Graceland album with Ladysmith Black Mambazo, a South African group that does sort of traditional South African sort of music, and there was sort of a big blow up of is this the right thing to do, because you're doing business with South Africa, which most of the music community was boycotting. And then the response was, well, but at the same time, what we're doing is meeting with indigenous, that's sort of a silly word, but meeting with the actual people there, right? We're
not
actually,
the government, yeah.
Now I think the difference you can make there is there was a private economy in South Africa, whereas there is not in China. And maybe those are the two distinctions. But it was just, again, I think that's, and again, it just happened to occur to me because I mentioned F.W. de Klerk a couple minutes ago, and Paul Simon's, a song from Graceland popped up on my Spotify playlist. But my point is that argument of engagement, even in a country where we think it may be futile, has been there for some time, and I think there's two sides to it. But I don't see that there is a Ladysmith Black Mambazo to partner with in China at this point.
No, not given the incredible, not incredible, but the.
I'm sure there is in Taiwan, right?
Yeah,
but,
yeah. But yeah, and like I said, China, given that it's the second largest economy in the world, it presents challenges that South Africa and even Russia don't
exactly. Yeah, it's easier to say, well, we're just going to boycott South Africa.
Yeah, we can't boycott China. That's just not work.
Although I wouldn't say it wasn't totally painless to say we would boycott South Africa.
Yeah, but it would be just inconceivable to boycott China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, well, let's go back to the domestic front. And this last week we saw, well, I wouldn't call it a victory for federal firearms regulation, sort of a holding action, I guess you will. This last week, there was a brief order the Supreme Court issued staying a ruling from a Texas district court judge that this judge invalidated the administration's regulation on so-called ghost guns. And for those who don't know, those are weapons without serial numbers that are found in other weapons. And of course, that makes them difficult to impossible to trace, right?
It's not the backpacks from like that Bill Murray had.
Yeah. So now last year, the ATF issued regulations that clarified what constitutes a firearm under federal law. And in this clarification, it included what are called so-called ghost gun kits. And these are kits that are sold in pieces, essentially, with the buyer having to make some sort of a quick, simple modification, like to file off a piece, what have you. It takes a few minutes to turn the kit into a working weapon. And so what this means is that the kits are now classified as firearms, and that would require on the kits the inclusion of serial numbers, federal licensing for sellers, recording sales, and background checks. Now, the administration says, well, this is common sense. The Solicitor General, Elizabeth Prelogar, she argued in the government's emergency appeal to the court that every speaker of English would recognize that a tax on the sales of, say, bookshelves applies to IKEA when it sells boxes of parts and the tools and instructions for assembling them into bookshelves. And the court's insistence on treating guns differently contradicts ordinary usage and makes a mockery of Congress's careful regulatory scheme. But
why does she assume everyone speaks English?
Well, yeah, but that's not how the Texas judge, Reed O'Connor, and the district court judge saw it. in ruling against the administration's regulation, he said Congress could have described a firearm as a set of parts that may be readily assembled into a weapon as it did for destructive device. Congress could have written all these things, and the very definition of firearm demonstrates that Congress knew the words that would accomplish these ends. But Congress did not regulate firearms as such, let alone aggregations of parts that are designed to or may readily be completed, assembled, restored, or otherwise converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. Now, at least 5 justices seem to think that the government has at least a reasonable chance of succeeding on appeal, which is why you grant a stay in the first case. But there are 4 members of the court, Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. They would have voted against issuing the stay, suggesting to me, and I imagine to you, Jay, that they may be more sympathetic to Justice O'Connor's view. And I guess the question for me is, how sympathetic are you to Justice O'Connor's view as opposed to what you might call the IKEA interpretation of this? I
have infinite sympathy for and compassion for all kinds of people, Mike. Was this? We should note, was this order issued on the shadow docket?
Ooh, the shadow docket. It was an emergency order, yeah.
Leftists who frequently complain about the dark shadow docket. This is a shadow docket decision that they should like. So without doing a whole deep dive, first of all, let's go back to what this is. This is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to stay an appellate court ruling pending certiorari.
Not a ruling on the merits. Yeah.
So I think we're not talking about policy. We're talking about should this take effect immediately. I'm sympathetic to the idea that you probably don't get the stay. In terms of, what is the irreparable harm? Now, I guess the argument is the irreparable harm is to my Second Amendment right to get this done. But then also, is this a, even assuming, and I'm not sure how you work the Bruin sort of history test into this, right? But let's just treat it like it was a regular constitutional analysis, and there's the means the least restrictive. It doesn't seem that restrictive. I mean, if you can always go out and buy a fully manufactured handgun, and maybe if your point is, well, you're sort of a DIY guy, or it's just a fun hobby or something. I don't know.
Well, the difference being is the lack of a serial number, right? And that's
right. And that's what my point is that's a tough. The means seems to be it's not unreasonable to reach that end, right? So I don't see irreparable harm in allowing the statute to stay in place while we get a final ruling on the merits from the Court of Appeals. On the now, and I think here's the thing: I think reasonable minds could reach different conclusions on whether it ought to be stayed. I'd tend to be with the majority on this one. And the other piece is, right, it's also just a question of for the Supreme Court, maybe do we take this up now or do we take this up later?
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.